This is a quick overview of Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, Department of Education. You know that this project is 922 pages. It comes in 7 sections. A quick look at them. We have a foreword, something called Taking the Reins of Government, the Common Defense, the General Welfare, the Economy, Independent Regulatory Agencies, and the afterword, which is called Onward. We're going to focus on the general welfare. And just to show you what is included in that, it includes the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, which of course is what we're going to look at, Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Department of the Interior, Department of Justice, Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, and Veterans Affairs. Now let's go specifically to education. The author of this section is Lindsay Burke. She belongs to something called Learn for Life for charter schools, and she believes very much in universal school choice. She supports those things, charter schools and universal school choice. She denigrates what she calls federal preschool incompetence. Apparently, she feels that the Head Start program that has been going on for about 50 years is incompetent. She does not believe in the changes to Title IX, which has to do with sex and gender among students. And she feels that illegal immigration has been very bad for our public schools. Burke says to eliminate the Department of Education by phasing it out over a 10-year period. She is fond of the work of Milton Friedman, who in 1955 said that he believes in schooling wherein education is publicly funded, but education decisions are made by families. Burke supports this philosophy. So she is very interested in these things called ESA, an education savings account for each child, funded overwhelmingly by taxpayers. In other words, each child gets its part of the tax money for education to go to the parents, and the parents may invest that money in any school, public, private, or charter, or religious school, or anything. Now, she takes a few minutes to talk about higher education, and we're just going to take a little side trip here just to give you a feeling of what Burke says about it. She feels that our higher education in the United States is hostile to free expression, hostile to academic inquiry, and hostile to American exceptionalism. In fact, she calls our higher education captured by woke diversicrats. Burke gives us a quick history of the Education Department. She says it was born of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which suggested that disadvantaged students needed some support and help. It was formally established in 1980 by Jimmy Carter, and the purpose ostensibly was to reduce the cost of education and increase its efficiency. She says the opposite has occurred. She calls the Department of Education a single captive agency that lets people promote their agenda across the administration. And an example she gives is that due to COVID, when ESSER funds were given out, schools were required to show that they had an equity plan. And that just goes to show that it's a captive agency that lets people promote their agendas. Burke says the Department of Education is ineffective, duplicative, and unproductive. And what is the solution? Take that money and give block grants to states. ESA's educational savings accounts will be managed by charitable foundations. She said this will give more choice to federal children. By federal children, she means children who go to public schools in Washington, D.C., or go to Department of Defense schools, or to schools on Indian reservations. She says block grants will give more state and local control to education. Student loans will be repaid instead of forgiven. It will allow them to reject gender ideology, reject critical race theory. And this will be the end of executive overreach, Burke says. She says that our Department of Education has a history of failure. She says federal intervention in education has failed to promote student achievement. Reading outcomes have been unchanged for over 30 years. Declines in math performance have been shown. Test scores have begun declining in 2013 to 2015. And she refers to a 1998 report that shows test scores that are just as bad as they are today. So Burke concludes that the reality is that schools and school districts have spent 50 million hours or more on paperwork to get only 65 to 70 cents of every dollar that has been invested for schools. She says, again, the solution is give the money to the states. Give it as per pupil allocations. Each child gets however many children you have to go to school in that state, that's how much you get allocated. And she says you can give these as grants for any lawful education purpose under state law. Burke says we should reform, eliminate, or move the department's programs and offices to appropriate agencies. And she does lay out the plans for how she would do that. And she says we should repeal these laws. First of all, we should repeal the 1994 charter school grant program. She said rescind the requirements and lessen the restrictions. We should repeal the 2021 changes to the civil rights data collection, which has to do with data on a new non-binary sex category and data on teams that are only male or female students. She says we should repeal the federal loan programs that were expanded in 2023, and we should repeal Title IX. She calls this Biden's effort to gut the hard-earned rights of women. Now, Burke tells us how we should deal specifically with Title IX. We should reverse it, she says, because there is no scientific or legal basis for redefining sex to sexual orientation and gender identity. She says Title IX encourages children to seek experimental medical interventions. Burke wants us to restore the Betsy DeVos regulations of 2020 that state that sex is simply what was written on your birth certificate. And she says we have to protect faith-based educational institutions and programs and activities. She goes on to say this about Title IX. It has redefined sex as sexual orientation and gender identity with no scientific basis. She says sex is a fixed biological fact, and we should drop all Title IX charges and investigations against schools and academic institutions that have apparently not followed the Title IX rules. Then Burke talks about Title VI, and this is about discipline, and she says it has had a disparate impact. Burke says that federal overreach has pushed school leaders to prioritize racial parity in school discipline indicators over student safety. She talks about restorative justice. She says they are policies that substantially harmed academics and school climate. And she says we should no longer investigate Title VI cases that exclusively rest on allegations of disparate impact because it is a pretext for theoretically endless federal meddling. Next, Burke talks about IDEA. She says this 2017 regulation should be rescinded. It stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And she says since 2017, they have now been considering race and ethnicity when they talk about discipline. She says this is based on false assumptions, and schools are raiding special education funding to pay for CRT, critical race theory, inspired equity consultants. In other words, if the child who is having a disciplinary problem is of a minority race or ethnicity, special education money is being siphoned off to pay for an equity consultant inspired by critical race theory. Burke says that we provide school meals to children in need. We should not use federal meals to support radical ideology. She says the school meal program is now an entitlement for nearly all students, regardless of family income levels, and we should prohibit connecting school meals with Title IX enforcement. Remember, that's about sex and gender. Burke talks about student data. She says it's one of the most important factors. She says that one of the most important factors influencing student educational achievement and attainment is family structure. Therefore, student data related to family structure should be made publicly available. Do you have one parent or two? Are your parents the same sex, or are they male and female, etc., etc.? Burke says to rescind the NEA's, National Education Association's, congressional charter. She says the teachers' union is a radical special interest group that overwhelmingly supports left-of-center policies. The NEA has used taxpayer money, she says, for radical causes favoring a single political party. Burke says we should reinforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Critical race theory forces students to defend the false idea that America is systemically racist. Parents should be able to review curricular materials online. Burke calls for a Parental Rights Act to protect parental rights in education. She says if we're not careful, schools might assist students in social or medical gender transition. They might demand curriculum or lessons regarding critical race or gender theory. So we need a Parents' Bill of Rights for relief, together with attorneys' fees and costs if a prevailing party. And parents must be notified before any school system support for radical gender ideology. Burke says we must ban school personnel who are addressing students with pronouns not related to the birth certificate or biological gender without parental permission. We should ban school personnel who are keeping secrets from parents about their children. She advocates for advanced school choice policies. She says we need a broader voucher system. We need that ESA program, Educational Savings Accounts. We need full control of the admissions process for private schools. Burke says educators at Department of Defense schools worldwide are using radical gender theory and critical race theory in lessons advocating for more racial discrimination. She says we must consider the extent to which accreditors have forced colleges and universities, many faith-based institutions, to adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that conflict with federal civil rights laws, state laws, and the institutional mission and culture of the schools. She says that we must cap indirect costs at universities. They cross-subsidize leftist agendas and the research of billion-dollar organizations such as Google and the Ford Foundation. We should use this cash to pay for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. She says we should cap donations from private organizations to help reduce federal taxpayer subsidizations of leftist agendas. Burke insists we must confront the Chinese Communist Party's influence on higher education. She calls for us to eliminate the list of shame related to religious exemptions for faith-based colleges. She says we must report on the negative influence of action civics. Action civics means encouraging students to learn history and citizenship by doing. And this is how one might feel after reading that report.